My name's Gareth and I run the Fat Bear. We're an American regional restaurant, but we've got a huge emphasis, as you can probably tell from this back bar here, on American whiskey in particular. Whiskey generally, it does depend on which territory you're in and exactly what the legal definition is, but broadly speaking, it's a distilled spirit. It's usually at least 37.5%, I think is the very lowest. Typically you would see it at 40 though. So at least 40% ABV. In the States, generally they distill more to 45% as a standard. And it typically has to have been aged for at least 2 years, because I mean, fundamentally it starts as vodka and then it sits in a barrel, more or less is the most succinct way of putting it. So the time in oak converts it into then being whiskey. There's certain definitions around, say, being a straight whiskey or a Tennessee whiskey or this, that and the other, which will imply there are other more specific rules or conventions around it. But yeah, at its heart, it's distilled grains, 2 years, in oak barrels at the minimum, and then whatever else they do afterwards. Traditional Irish and Scottish, you're generally seeing malted barley there. You can get wheat whiskies from all over the place, but yeah, in terms of American whiskey versus the rest of the world, Americans do make some malted barley whiskies, but they're few and far between. So there's Westland and I think a couple of other Coval, but for the most part they focus on corn and rye, so the two most readily available grains, or certainly the historical development, they were the most readily available. Of course, you can't get malted barley without any problems now, but the traditions and the history dictate and have shaped where those have come from. Whereas in England, or Scotland, we don't grow so much in the way of rye and corn and don't have such a history of using it to make whiskey. Although once again, there's no reason you couldn't do it over here. So I mean, what's interesting here is actually it all comes from a similar range, or the same range, called the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. They do a new release every year and the slight details change, but the core of what it is remains the same. So it's from the Buffalo Trace Distillery, which is in Frankfort in Kentucky. It's owned by the Sazerac Distilling Company, who is sort of the big parent, and then the Buffalo Trace Distillery is one of the distilleries at which they make a great many of their best whiskies. It's overseen by both Drew Mayville, who's the master blender, and then you've got Harlan Wheatley, who's the master distiller, and between the two of them working hand in hand through warehouse management, through choosing what goes in, where they're sourcing, how they're managing the bottles and the movement of barrels, and all these very complex, hundreds of different variables create wildly different whiskies on an individual basis, which is what we see here, where you've got single barrel whiskies. But then their more commercial stuff will be carefully blended to get consistency of flavour across every release. So the one you've got here first is George T. Stagg. This is a bourbon, so a very classic bourbon. So Buffalo Trace being quite readily available in supermarkets, that sort of thing. This is the sort of the standard version of it. And George T. Stagg is its very grown-up big brother. So what you've got here is the same juice fundamentally, but it's gone and sat in casks for probably about 15 years, give or take. And it's served at barrel strength, so it's come straight out, it's uncut, unfiltered, they don't do anything with it. Take it straight out the barrel and they put it in a bottle, as opposed to other whiskies more conventionally available where it will get watered down to a certain percentage, sort of 40 or 45%, depending on where you're buying it from and the style of the drink. So this is 129.2 proof, which is basically 65% pure alcohol, which you'd imagine would be very unmanageable, but actually is really delicious. It's not one you're going to be doing on a long session necessarily, but it's a great one for after dinner or something where you really want just that big intense punch filled with kind of fudge, caramel, that kind of thing, a lot of brown sugar, a lot of spice, a lot of heat, nice cherry wood. I mean, whiskey's a very personal thing, so obviously exactly what you taste will depend, but it's very, very classic, very quintessential flavours of what bourbon would tend to provide. Not all bourbons come from Kentucky, which is usually the expectation, although this particular one does. Bourbon has an absolute ton of rules around it from 1909, I think the Taft laws. The very important ones to keep in mind is it has to be 51% corn or higher, and the same thing then applies if you're having a rye whiskey. It needs to be obviously rye dominant. So 51% corn, but it could be as little as that, or it could be 100% corn. It totally varies. Most places, I think this mash bill spec, they don't announce it publicly, but it's widely known to be probably about 85%, give or take, corn, 5% malted barley, and then 10% rye, but it's all approximate. So that's the one thing, the mash bill has to be 51% corn or more. Then it needs to be aged, most crucially, in virgin wood barrels, or virgin oak barrels, so it needs to never have contained anything else. First fill, you use it, and then you sell it. So the vast majority, I don't know the vast majority, but an awful lot of barrels for wine, for aging rum, for aging spirits of all descriptions, many of them are ex-bourbon, because other spirits will reuse barrels as long as they see fit, whereas bourbon, used once, has to be thrown away. So there's an awful lot of them around, and that tends to be then recycled rather than thrown away. So the distinction between bourbon and other forms of American whiskey, it rather depends. Against rye, it will be a reweighting, where you move from that corn dominance to rye dominance. So for example, we'll have later on a mash bill where it's probably 85% rye, 10% maybe corn or wheat, and then 5% malted barley. But once again, it really totally depends on the producer, but it will be rye-led, sometimes with other things to soften it. Likewise, wheat whiskey needs to be predominantly wheat, but you can have other blended grains in there as well. So moving on from having looked at the Stagg, we now look at William Larue Weller. This is a wheated bourbon, so it's not a wheat whiskey, but a wheated bourbon. So it's very similar in terms of the constitution of what grains go into it, but instead of having that 10% rye, it's probably about 10% wheat instead. And wheat gives this slight creaminess, typically, is how it's described. Rye tends to be a bit more spicy, a bit more acidic, almost kind of appley sometimes. It depends on the particular species of rye you're using. But what you're looking at here, contrasted against the George T. Stagg, is just a little bit rounder, a little bit softer, a little bit creamier. Otherwise, quite similar in style. This is another one of these cask strength, straight out the barrel. No filtering, no messing around, just straight into the bottle after it's been distilled and aged. You'll get an awful lot of evaporation while these things are sitting in and aging. So if you've got, for example, 15 years worth of evaporation, you could have as much as, I think in this instance, it's around about 70% evaporation of everything. So it becomes highly concentrated, and that's how you get it to those sorts of levels of strength of 65%. This one in particular, I think for this release, we're looking at 64.1%, so 128.2 proof. So, I mean, it's very, very big. 2/3 of it is pure alcohol. But whilst it does taste like it, it also tastes delicious. So then we move on to the third. This is the Thomas Handy Sazerac. So Thomas Handy was the bartender who first started using rye whiskey in the very famous New Orleans cocktail called a Sazerac. There's a lot of debate amongst drinks historians about the precise background of the Sazerac, as to whether it was cognac or rye first, and there's I defer to better historians on the truth of it, but suffice to say the first rye-based Sazerac was made by Thomas Handy, so the story goes. And the Sazerac is just very, very simply the spirit, so in this case the rye whiskey, a little bit of Pichot bitters, which is sort of an aromatic bitters, very popular in New Orleans, a little kiss of sugar, and a touch of absinthe as well, but once again just a very, very small amount rather than it dominating the drink. Stirred down, served very, very simply. Super delicious. And this happens to make probably the best Sazerac you can have. So this, in contrast to the other two whiskies that we had earlier, it's similarly another one of these barrel strength. It's come straight out and straight into the bottle. So it's sitting at a very high ABV. Once again, I think here we're looking in the 60s, 63.1% ABV. So this is a rye whiskey as opposed to a bourbon or a wheated bourbon, which means the mash bill, i.e. the grains that go in right at the beginning prior to the distillation process, is predominantly rye. In this mash bill, I believe there's a little corn and a bit of malted barley as well, although once again they don't make public the precise composition as far as I'm aware. Now this is, in spite of being a very famous rye whiskey and sitting alongside some stuff that's been aged for 15 plus years, this is actually a very young whiskey, so it's typically about 6 years, give or take. So it's a bit brighter, a bit fruitier, a bit brasher. It's less focused on the qualities that would specifically oak imparts over time. So yeah, big, fruity. It's in the same vein as a nice cognac in that regard, so it makes an absolutely cracking Sazerac as a result. So the fourth one we're looking at is Eagle Rare 17. So when we were talking earlier about George T. Stagg being the really big brother of Buffalo Trace, the standard whiskey, this is sort of the middle child. So rather than it having been aged 15 years and then just bottled straight out of the barrel, this instead is aged for 17. I think it had something ridiculous like a 90% evaporation. So if you imagine of the 100% of that liquid that went in, only a tenth of that remained after that length of time sitting in a very hot part of a warehouse. So what we have is effectively very, very, very concentrated, and then it's proportioned with water to get it to that 90 proof, so 45% ABV. So in comparison to the others, it's a far easier, more drinkable whiskey. It's a lot gentler. It's still, because it's at 45%, it's got that nice bit of extra oomph, but it's a lot more tame compared to some of those cask strength ones. So once again, mash bill here, you're looking at that classic bourbon mash bill. This is very much a bourbon, so predominant corn, and it spent an awful lot of time in oak, but not too much. It's very licorice-led. It's got a lot of leather. It's got a lot of tobacco. Say similar kinds of expressions to the other first two bourbons and wheated bourbons, but it's a little bit more sophisticated. It's a bit more elegant rather than being big, brash, and bruisey. And then finally, in the similar vein, we've got the Sazerac 18, so only a year's difference between them, but actually came out, I think, at something like a 75% dilution or something like that. So this has been aged for basically, give or take a year, the same as the bourbon that we just went through, and it's bottled at that same proof. So in the same way that this reflects the George T. Stagg as being aged for a long time and then cut with water to a certain percentage, this is the same thing as the Thomas Handy Sazerac, having then spent another 12 years sitting in that cask and then rewatered to that same level of 90 proof. So what you see here is a very, very drinkable, very smooth rye whiskey. It's very sophisticated in comparison to the Thomas H. Handy, which is, it's like a big punch in the face of flavour, whereas this is, a velvet glove caressing you. It's delightful though, really, really nice. Once again, big, spicy rye flavours, lots of lovely tobacco notes, cedar, leather, all of those classic kind of things that you tend to get from very heavily aged whiskies.